This week, we are not learning many new Python programming constructs, but we will be learning techniques to solve more problems, mostly using loops. So we studied two types of loops. One is an indefinite loop, that is the while loop. While a condition is true, you execute a bunch of statements. The other one was a for loop. For, you put a target variable here and you put the word in and you generate a sequence. We could generate a sequence using the range function. You can put a list, and there are other methods too, which we haven't really seen. And you put a bunch of statements here. These statements will be executed for each element of the sequence. Now, we are going to talk about three techniques using stuff that we have already learned. The first one is about input validation, which you have actually seen a little bit. You have used it to some extent in your assignments. So we will explore this a little more this week. After that, we will talk about sentinels, which also you have been exposed to, and we will study in more detail. And finally, we will look at what are called nested loops. You have already seen loops, but here the question is, how do you put a loop inside another? So first, let's talk about input validation. The reason is programs are basically dumb things. They just do whatever you specify in your program, no more, no less. And they read data. If you put in wrong data, you get wrong output. Garbage in, garbage out. If bad data is fed to the program, you will get some output, you may get some output, but it is not going to be correct. So we don't want to do such things. For example, let's start with this situation. Here is a program that reads in the number of hours worked by an employee, that is the first line, and then it asks for the pay rate. And if the number of hours worked is more than 40, it asks for the overtime pay rate and computes the total pay. Otherwise, it computes the pay without asking for the overtime pay rate. Let's talk about the situation. What if the input is negative? So here we have a statement that reads in the number of hours worked. We can check if the number of hours worked is more than or equal to 0, then only we will process any input that may be given to the program. So if we get a valid hours worked, then we ask for the pay rate. And if the pay rate is more than 0, then there is a point in checking whether the number of hours worked is more than 40. Then we can ask for the overtime pay rate. I did not include a check here. You can do that. So that is an exercise for you at home. You can check if overtime pay rate is a valid value. If so, you will compute these things. So this will give you a little bit of experience. So notice that I am not checking this purposely. It's for you to get some experience. If the hours worked is more than 40, you do all this. If not, you compute the pay for the regular, using the regular salary rate, pay rate. If pay rate is 0 or less, you display an error message. If the hours worked is less than 0, you display an error message. But this doesn't yeah, this checks for the input, but it doesn't give the user a chance to correct the issue. If the user makes an error, the program simply ends. Sometimes that is not desirable. If you want to do that, if you want to take care of the errors and still give the user a chance to correct their input, you can use a loop. So here is how you do that. You read in the number of hours worked, and then you use a while loop to check if hours worked is less than 0. If so, you are entering this loop, you are iterating and asking for the hours worked with a suggestion as to what went wrong. And if the hours worked is still less than 0, you continue iterating. You will get out of this loop once hours worked is greater than or equal to 0. Then you ask for the pay rate, and if the pay rate is not to your liking, you again loop. Then you check whether the person has worked overtime. Notice that I'm not checking for the overtime pay rate to be a valid value. You can put in the necessary checks as a loop. So that is another piece of work for you to be done at home, so that you get some experience checking for input and then iterating until it is correct. So how do you validate input? You get the input. This is the pseudocode, obviously. Get the input. So you will, in your Python code, you will have an input statement. And you need to use a while loop. A for loop is not going to be sufficient here. The reason being, a for loop executes a fixed number of times. So here you don't know how many iterations you need to have before getting the correct value. So while input is not valid, whatever that check is, display an error message, get the next piece of input, and check if the new input is correct. If it is not valid, continue iterating. Once you get out of this loop, you know that the input is valid. The reason is that if it were invalid, you would have continued the loop. Now you can process the input. So this is the general structure of input validation. Let me now show you one more example before we move on to other things. Suppose you need to read a value like width, and it should be divisible by 8. So you read that value, and if it is not divisible by 8, that is, the remainder after division by 8 should be 0. That is what we want. If it is not 0, we continue the loop. We enter the loop and ask for a number that is divisible by 8. If this new value is also not divisible by 8, we iterate further. And below this loop, you can process this value. So that is input validation. The second concept here is regarding sentinels. As I said before, you have seen this idea. A sentinel ends a sequence. For example, we saw a problem where we had to read a sequence of numbers that are 0 or more. And when you get a negative number, you end the program. We had to count the number of, we had to add up the number of even numbers and odd numbers in that sequence. We have seen that problem already. And we only processed numbers that are 0 or more. If we got a negative number, we immediately quit the program. That negative number is said to be a sentinel in that context. A sentinel is a value that ends a sequence. It is not part of the data to be processed. So you get a number of pieces of data and you process all of those pieces, And then you get a value that is not considered part of the data. For example, if you are processing a sequence of positive values, a negative value could be considered a sentinel. Perhaps the string END in capitals could be considered a sentinel. A line with no input, not even a space, could be considered a sentinel. Perhaps, in some context, a line with a few dollar symbols could be considered as sentinel. What a sentinel is basically an agreement between the user and the developer. You think of something that cannot be part of legal input, and that could be thought of as ending the sequence. I cannot tell you exactly what a sentinel value should be. That really depends on the problem. You have to know what valid input you can have in the data that you want to process, and then come up with something that is different from all this. So you'll have to talk to your end user and ask what constitutes legal data and what the user is willing to provide to show that the data has ended. Okay, that is part of understanding the problem. Now let's take a situation. Suppose you want to read a sequence of numbers, negative numbers, zeros, and positive numbers. So any number is fine. You want to find out the average of a bunch of numbers, and they can be -5, -8, 0, 25, 30, etc., etc. Then what could be a sentinel? Well, let's, for the purpose of this problem, say that if the user types a line with no data in it, then there are no more numbers. So the user enters 7, 5, 3, 2, -6, 0, 25, etc., etc., sequence of numbers. And then finally, in response to a prompt to enter a number, the user hits the enter key. Doesn't type even a space, just hits the enter key. Now you have entered the data. That is the understanding. But what happens if you have an input statement like this to read when the user has typed nothing and hit the enter key? And if this is the statement that you have in your program, number equals int input, enter a number. So I typed this as a Python program, executed it, and found that it wouldn't work. The program prompted me to enter a number, and I hit the enter key without typing anything, and the program crashed because it was not able to convert this to an integer. So this is not going to work. So what is the solution? The solution is to read this input as a string. So if you don't convert the input to an int, unlike here, on top of the input, we are converting that input to an int. If you don't do that, you can enter empty string. You can afford to not type in anything and hit the enter key. And this is a string. And what Python will do is it will have the empty string in this variable. So when I print this, I get whatever is typed in by the user. And if I don't type in anything, as in this execution, there is nothing printed. So I can use that idea here. I will read in an input. I will prompt the user for a number, read in the stuff typed in by the user, and if it is not equal to the empty string, while the value is not the empty string, I will convert that string to a number. So if the user entered 25, it is not going to be empty. It is going to be the string 25. And I will convert that to a number. Number will now be 25. I will print that number or process the number. I can do whatever I want with the number here. And I ask for the next number in the same way that I asked before the loop. Now, if the user enters 30, the value would be the string 30. It is not equal to the empty string. I will convert it to the number 30. I will print 30. Then I will ask for the next number. And if the user hits the enter key without typing in anything, the value would be equal to the empty string. I will quit. So in this example, I am entering 3 here, the first line. And since I will be getting the string version of 3, it is not equal to the empty string. I will be converting that 3 to a number, printing that number. I get the 3. Then I will ask for the next number. I typed in 4. It comes in as a string. That is also not empty. I will convert that to the integer version. I will print it here. Then I will ask for the next number. I typed in 5. The string 5 comes in. I will convert that 5 to the number, the integer representation, and store it in number. And I will print 5. Then I entered the empty string, and this comparison produces the false value, and I will quit the loop. Now, for the third technique to be studied this week, that is called nested loops. You have a loop, a for loop or a while loop. You can put a loop inside that, and you can keep on, that is called a nested loop, and you can keep on nesting these loops. So let's look at this problem. Suppose you want to have this kind of a behavior. The program prompts for a number, and that is the number of lines it will print. And suppose I type in 7, the program is going to print a row of 7 stars, then a row of 6 stars, then a row of 5, 4, 3, 2, finally a row of 1 star. How do I do this? I cannot really have a single loop. Of course, I can, if I really wanted just 7 rows, I can have 7 print statements. But here, the number of rows is a variable. It can change from execution to execution. So I need a loop. And you can see that that loop will print 1 row in each iteration. But then what do you do for each iteration? You have to print different numbers of stars. So you need to do a little bit of analysis. So let's call these rows 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The reason I started numbering this with 0 is this. If you want to have 7 rows, you will, and suppose that 7 is stored in a variable like rows. Okay, suppose we have a variable called rows. You will use range and then put rows in parentheses. And it will produce the sequence 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we can think of the lines as numbered from 0 through 6. That corresponds to the way Python numbers are produced when you put a range function with just a number stuck in. So range 7 produces 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. right? So we are going to use the numbers 0 through 6 for this example. And I can check this again. When I am in row 0, I need 7 stars. In row 1, I need 6 stars, etc. So I created a table, and I want to see what the relationship is between the row number and number of stars. Well, here is where you have to do some thinking. If you add up the row and the number of stars, that is always 7. 0 plus 7 is 7. 1 plus 6 is 7. 2 plus 5 is 7, etc. 6 plus 1 is 7. So the row number plus the number of stars for that row is equal to the number of rows that you need. Or in other words, the number of stars is going to be number of rows minus the row number. So if you plug in 7 as the number of rows, and if you are on row 3, you know that the number of stars is 4. So what I am planning to do is have a loop inside the outer loop. So I'll have a loop that prints one line for each row. That I will call the outer loop. Inside that, I will have another loop that iterates these many times. So I'll have range number of rows minus row for the loop that is placed inside the outer loop. So the code would be like this. You ask for the number of rows, and then you iterate. This is called the outer loop for row in range rows, because we need these many rows. If the user entered 7, I need to iterate 7 times. And we know from the previous slide that the number of times you need to iterate in the inner loop, this is called the inner loop because it is placed inside the other loop. And also this is said to be nested in the outer loop, or the outer loop is supposed to be nesting the inner loop. So there are a number of terms: outer loop, inner loop, nested loop, nesting loop, and nesting. We have nesting here. So we have a second loop, an inner loop placed in the outer loop that iterates these many times, number of rows minus row. And number of rows is actually in this variable rows. So I have exactly that equation here. Only thing is, instead of number of rows, I have the variable name rows. And I am printing 1 star for each iteration. But I don't want to skip to the next line. So I have this end equals empty string, meaning do not go to the next line. Do not start a new line after printing this. Instead, print this. What is that? Empty. So nothing is printed, and it does not skip to the next line. So I'll print a star, then I will not skip to the next line and iterate again if the sequence hasn't ended. And I will print the next star, and I will keep on printing stars and never skip. After printing all the stars for a column, I will come to this line. Note that this is not part of the loop. It is indented along with this F. This P and F are in the same column position. So after the for loop completes, I'll be printing nothing, but the purpose of this print statement is to skip to the next line so that the next line would start at column 1 as needed. Now, suppose we want another behavior. You want to accept, again, the number of rows. You need to print 7 lines, but they should look like this. What is the pattern here? In the first line, I have 2 stars. Second line, I have 2 stars. Third line, I have 2 stars. So every line has 2 stars. But between the 2 stars in the first line, I have no space. Between the 2 stars in the next line, I have 1 space. Here I have 2 spaces, 3 spaces, 4 spaces, 5 spaces, 6 spaces. So the number of spaces increases by 1 for each row. How do I construct a program? I need a loop, an outer loop to print each line. And within the outer loop, I will have loops, multiple loops, or actually one loop, rather multiple print statements. One to print, I don't have multiple loops inside, but I will have one print statement to print a star, and a second print statement to print the second star, but I need a loop to print the spaces between the stars. So I need to construct, or at least analyze, what that loop is going to look like. So what I did was I again created a table for each row numbered from 0 through 6 for this example, and the number of spaces between the two ending stars is written here. For the first row, row 0, number of spaces between the first and the second star is 0. For the second row, row number is 1. There is 1 space. You can check the picture. And row number 2, 2 spaces, etc. Here you can easily see what the relationship is between these. The row number is the same as the number of spaces. So the number of iterations for the loop is going to be equal to the row number. So my code is going to be like this: accept the number of rows. Then I have an outer loop for printing each line. And within the outer loop, I will print a star, that is the first star. And I need end equals empty string so that I continue with the same line. And I have a print to print the last star. And after printing the last, or rather the second star, there are only 2 stars actually, I need to skip to the next line, so I don't have end equals something here. So this prints the first star, this prints the second and last star, and this will skip to the next line. But between these, I'm printing spaces. So I'm printing 1 space here and not skipping a line. And the number of iterations of this loop is the same as the row number.